Alright, well, unlike part 3, where the main problem I had with it was not only finding the time, but also the motivation, this one I found the motivation for, just struggled with the time element. However, I think I found a way to get a more consistent reading schedule, so we'll see how long it takes for me to get to part 5, but all in due time. So, part 4 picks up very immediately after part 3, actually. Marius not really being at peace with potentially leading his father's savior to prison, decided to just kind of skip town, and also he didn't want to be part of that trial. However, when the still not really sure if I figured out how to say his name. I'll just say the innkeeper to say it easier. So when the innkeeper was brought to prison, Marius was able to find out where his cell was, and he kept slowly sending him money every so often. Even though the innkeeper was just like, what is this coming from? Oh, whatever, just take it. And from there, Marius just kind of did some wandering around, trying to figure out if life was even worth living now that Cosette was basically all but cut away from his life. However, that is when the innkeeper's daughter, Epinone, I believe. I keep wanting to say Epitone, but that's something differently. She does actually come through on her promise, and she shows him to Cosette's house. Now here's where the story takes a little bit of time travel. I was going to say backseat, but that wouldn't be right. So, this house, it used to belong to a lawyer who was, shall we say, really into the ladies. However, being such a high-standing civil servant, he had to keep that reputation a secret. So, there is a secret back door to the place, and while it was in a bit more of a prevalent part of town back in the day, it has fallen very much into disrepair, and a lot of people don't even know who owns the land anymore. So, when Jean Valjean picked this place, it was perfect. Had a secret exit in case he was ever found out, and it was secluded enough that nobody would be poking around asking questions. And with that bit of context, we then pick up the story from Jean's perspective. So even though he was putting on a big show and he put that giant hot iron through his arm, it hurt him and it infected him for several weeks, which, while he very much lamented this fact at first, he found it to be kind of a blessing as it gave him that quality father-daughter bonding time that he so loved. When he was well enough, he also hired a servant, somebody who was not only ancient, so it's hard to say if they would be able to say anything or ask questions, but they also spoke with a very intense stutter. With these major players in place, Marius then basically becomes a stalker for the next little while. This is where you really need the context of when this book came out, because it is framed as something a bit romantic, but today, if you see any guy exhibiting these behaviors, call the police. He would always kind of wander the grounds to see which way Cosette lived, as well as just trying to figure out how to build up the courage to be able to talk to her. So, Jean started noticing the shadows, and so did Cosette. So when Cosette was just like, Dad, there's some sort of shadow walking around, who could it be? Well, her fears were laid to rest when it was found out that it was just the chimney casting a shadow to make it look like a person. But Jean kind of filed it away as wondering if perhaps Jarvet might have gotten smart into his relocation and whatnot. This behavior kept up for the next few nights, until one night Cosette was tending to the garden, which was really her main hobby after she got out of the convent, when she looks next to her and she sees this rather large stone. Now first she kind of freaked out because it's like, okay, I did not put that stone there, and what is this underneath it? And she found Marius's love letter, to which he detailed about how he was such a loyal person to her love, that he was just there at all hours, staring very creepily. But once again, the book frames this as romantic rather than disturbing. And, well, Cosette, spending most of her life in the convent, doesn't really know about the ways of courtship. In fact, she was raised to be a nun, so it was kind of expected for her to not develop such feelings to begin with. Being ignorant, she sees the letter as also really romantic. Well, then again, it was also the time period, as I was saying. So, after that letter, Cosette accepted Marius's courtship, and every night they would meet each other in that secret little garden, and they would just absolutely love each other's company. I forget what famous author said this, but it said that if you want a happy ending, it all depends on where you stop the story. Once again, this would be another place to stop the story if you want a happy ending, but it keeps going. The innkeeper, as well as all his cohorts that was part of the abduction of Jean Valjean, all escape prison. And this is one of the more annoying things. Up to this point, this part, fantastic. The action's going. I'm very curious about the characters, and there's just a lot of fun back and forth. And then, as soon as they all escape, it is found out that they are speaking a language known as argot, which then Victor Hugo has to ruin by then describing for the next 15 pages. Look, can't you just say slang? It's like the equivalent of in English, how instead of people calling it a jailhouse, they're going to call it like the slammer, the squealer. If you go into a police cruiser, is known as the paddy wagon, or other such similar prison talk. In fact, just even saying prison talk would have just been fine, but, well, I guess they wanted an etymology? Or is that the study of bugs? I guess they just wanted to really break down the French in English. Well, it does say it is complete and unabridged, so that's one of the pitfalls that happens. Now, one of the other interesting players in this escape is a local gamin. Perhaps if you prefer tramp or street urchin. Basically a kid of the streets named Gavroche, which I get the feeling I'm not the only one that immediately thinks of the Dodger from Oliver Twist. It just kind of starts with figuring out what this character is all about, how he's able to maintain a living on the streets, a bit of a reputation with the more seedy crowd, shall we say, as well as his place of residence, which is the monument of a giant elephant, something that has very much fallen into disrepair as the years have gone on. But when Napoleon was large and in charge, this was a big sacred monument that a lot of people looked after. Now, the other thing that is interesting is we go to the Mrs. Innkeeper. Turns out that she is a huge misandrist. How in the world she ever got married to a man is the part that I find so curious about it. But simply put, whenever this woman had sons, they always found a way of just slowly being swept under the rug and being somebody else's responsibility. So the fascinating thing is, there's two sons this time that are discussed, and they are in the care of an aunt that is actually related to Marius's grandfather. Now, the basic idea is that she was involved in a settlement with him, so he had to pay her the child care. And it seemed like everything was going all right. Generally, each lived in the life of luxury. Until one day the two boys got home from playing, and there was just a simple piece of paper saying, "Yeah, you live here now." And it turned out that one of the neighbors said that their mother was taken into custody for some more shady dealings. So, The two brothers, with their little slip of paper with the new address, go make their way, when an unfortunate gust of winds blows it away, and they have no idea who's to take care of them anymore. So with no other options, they live on the street with Gavroche showing them the ropes. Now, the main reason I bring up this player is that the prison break went off mostly without a hitch, but they needed Gavroche's help to be able to come back with a rope to make sure that everybody was out safely. Now, that doesn't really bode too well with Marius and Cosette, though, as this motley crew finds the advantages that Jean Valjean does in this place, and they decide to try to take it over. But thankfully, Epinone is just as much of a stalker as Marius is, and she just wanted to make sure that the two lovebirds had company, or at least it would seem that way, but really she's got her own motivations for it. Through a lot of negotiations, she was able to send the prisoners to another place. And once again, seems like everything is lovely. Everything is going fantastically. That is until one of the nights when the lovely pair meet up, and Cosette is just bawling her eyes out, as it turns out that Jean Valjean is going to move sometime to England. With this in mind, Marius decides to play one last gambit. Now, you may remember from part 3 that even though he had very strained relationship with his grandfather, the grandfather still wanted to make sure that he was well taken care of in terms of money, and so would send him 100 pistols once a month for his daily allowance. He cut this off because Marius wanted to be proud that he didn't owe anybody anything. However, here is when he starts going back to grovel, as well as to potentially mend the bond between the two and potentially get his blessing. Now, we do kind of cut back a little bit to the grandfather, and it turns out that he was very much shaken up by Marius leaving, and he often hoped that he would come back, leaving his room perfectly preserved, as well as just trying to come up with some means of apology. However, that's what his internal monologue is saying. When he does see him at the door, he just immediately has that stone face, and he's just like, what do you want? Realize you couldn't make it out on your own? The youth these days, you're so weak. And there, Marius slowly starts to build up the courage that he wants the grandfather's blessing. The conversation seems to go well, until the grandfather is just kind of like, so let me get this straight. You have no job, she has no job, there's no money between the two of you, but yet you have a heart full of love. Marius, my boy, don't make her your wife, make her your mistress. She'd be a lot more useful to you that way. With that, Marius gathers his things and simply says, the last time I was here, you insulted the honor of my father, and now you insult the honor of my one true love. I will not take this any more. As he walked out and slammed the door behind him. That is when grandfather calls him one of his daughters. It's just like, what? No, you gotta get it back. We gotta figure this out. Please, Marius, no, come back. But it's too late. Everybody was out of earshot by the time he got on the next carriage and disappeared into the night. With this, Marius goes back one last time to Cosette's place, only to find that it is completely abandoned and there's absolutely no sign as to where anybody went. Now, it's at this time that there's rumblings of civil unrest, and Victor Hugo goes into another one of those rants where he goes to the next 10 to 15 pages trying to describe the difference between civil unrest and an insurrection. However, when the story does cut back, we zoom in onto this old father. And by father, I mean like the priestly father. So, he runs a rather poor monastery. And about the only joy he has in life is reading books. One of them, it's like a first edition, one-of-a-kind copy from the royal family. And one by one, he has to sell all those books. With that prize of his collection being the most expensive and sought after, and it's still just barely enough to keep the place afloat for another month. However, there is some hope in his eyes as he hears off in the distance explosions and gunfire, followed by one of his ecclesiastical sisters saying that there is an insurrection happening, and so he decides to head that way. And it's here we bump back into the friends of ABC. Turns out that this is the kind of thing they've been waiting for a long time, actually. However, not really sure which part of town they want to start their revolution in. They all meet up at this favorite bar of theirs, which Victor Hugo describes as alright atmosphere, but everybody that serves, both the head of the place as well as all the servants, are just about the ugliest creatures that you can imagine. Turned out that this was actually a good place, as this later becomes the head of a barricade for when the National Guard is about to come through. So we jump back to Marius while those preparations are happening, and not really seeing much of a reason to live again, is starting to think about just taking his own life. That is, until he finds his way back to the barricade, all the while being haunted by a voice that is slowly calling his name. In fact, even at the bar, there is somebody else asking for Marius as well. So, the barricades are set when night falls. When there's a rather amusing story about this one house that is like 3 or 4 stories tall, that would be a fantastic lookout point for the revolutionaries. This one guy, who obviously has a load of beer muscles, starts knocking at the door saying, "Hey, will you let us in?" Does this about 3 times before one of the windows opens, and he's just like, "No, I'm not gonna let you in." The guy's like, "I'll give you to the count of 3 to open the door, okay? Otherwise, your head's gonna go through the wall. 1, no, I can't let you in. 2, no, this is too scary. I don't want people. 3. He was dead. And so, it is up to the leaders of ABC to then take care of this man. They don't want the gunfire to attract the attention of the National Guard, and on top of that, they want to be just in their cause, and, well, they just killed an innocent man, so this lone drunk was then immediately killed for this, and then thrown out of the barracks in the most unceremonial way possible. Now, Gavroche is also on the scene, brandishing a horse pistol, which he keeps wanting to try to upgrade to a musket, or perhaps a carbine, but everybody sees him as like a little kid, and nobody is giving him any respect for it. However, he does earn a little respect when he looks over at one place at the bar, and he's like, that guy's a spy. Well, at first they don't believe him, but then they hold him down, and it turns out that it's Jarvit, back again. They tie him up, and they hold him as a hostage, not really sure what to do with him. It is there that off in the distance there is the faint rumbling of the National Guard coming in to squash this rebellion. It would have been very devastating if not for Marius coming in at just the right moment. However, even that was a pretty close call, as one of the guardsmen takes a shot at him, when this one mysterious guy out of nowhere blocks the shot with his hand, and then slowly starts to go down from the intense pain of it. They take care of that guardsman, and right before the action is about to get started, Marius says, "Come no closer, or this powder keg is going up in smoke." And Marius, being at a point of not really caring about his life either way, the guardsmen try to reason with him, and he's just like, "Yeah, I don't care." He slowly starts lowering the torch, and all the National Guardsmen just immediately run out. Now, It's a pretty good victory for the night, but everybody knows that the next day there's going to be at least double the troops, and they're going to be in for the fight of their life. From there, Marius is just kind of sitting down at one of the tables trying to figure out what he's going to do with his life. Once again, he's very tempted to just completely throw it away. That is, until the slumbering blob of the man that stopped the gunshot with his hand shows up. Turns out that it was actually Epinone in disguise. And it's pretty obvious from her wound that the bullet went through the hand and then into her lung, and she is slowly dying. With her last breath, she hands Marius a letter, asking him not to be cross with her, and as soon as she dies, that Marius is to kiss her forehead. Well, as Epinone dies, she says that she very much was in love with Marius. And as you could probably guess, that's the main reason that she's been hanging around to see if the relationship with Marius and Cosette was actually going to go anywhere. So, she dies. Marius kisses her on the forehead, and no sooner than that, places the body gently down and rips open that letter to realize that Cosette did indeed leave a forwarding address. With this address in hand, Marius writes one more letter, saying that he is still going to go through with killing himself, if nothing else just as a means to make sure that his restless spirit will be around Cosette for all time. Once again, call the police. No sooner does he write this letter, he gives it to the little street urchin, Gavroche. And it's really fascinating, as it reminds me a lot of Romeo and Juliet. But the difference here is that the letter is basically egging on Cosette to kill herself as well, as a ways for the two souls to be together forever, rather than the letter saying, I'm gonna fake my death, so don't kill yourself because of it, okay? So, Gavroche, being an urchin to the street, knows his way around and slowly starts to make his way to the address. We go back to Jean Valjean, who is just in ecstasy. He feels absolutely free from any sort of prying eyes in the new location, and is also happy to just realize that for the rest of his life he just has him and Cosette, and they'll be happy together forever. That is, until he spots Cosette's writing pad, the same one that she used to write the forwarding address to Marius. But this, he all of a sudden starts freaking out, realizing that, oh no, it's not going to be both of them together forever. Somebody else is taking her away from him. And not really sure what to do, he has the idea that whoever this mysterious Marius is has to be with the insurrection, and slowly starts making his way towards the action. Well, on his way, he runs into Gavroche, who then convinces him to give the letter to Jean. As he reads it, he realizes that Marius is about to commit suicide, and he's immediately overjoyed. The one threat that he has to his stable life is going to take care of itself. Which is just the thing I find absolutely confusing, is there was a major moral dilemma at the end of part 1, where he didn't want an innocent man to suffer for the crimes that he had committed, and so he turned himself in. He very much felt like if he was going to mend his ways whatsoever, he first had to make it right with his soul. And here he doesn't really care at the idea that he could save Marius from death. And I'm not going to lie, even as I'm reading this, I'm just kind of like, look, I mean, you're going to live in poverty, but it seems like both of you are happy. And why don't Marius and Cosette just talk to each other? I mean, Cosette's father is loaded. They'll be set for life. All they just have to do is be like, look, I've got nothing but love. And I get the feeling they can make it work. But I digress. So, Jean reads the letter multiple times, puts it in his pocket, and decides that he's going to keep this secret from Cosette. Now we go back to Gavroche for the very end of this particular section, where he sees this one cart where a civil servant is just passed out drunk in it. And Gavroche is like, this might actually be quite suitable for the barricade. So, gets the drunk out of the way. He's so drunk, it's not very easy to wake him. Takes the cart and starts making his way. However, he completely forgot that there was a guard barracks just before a revolutionary outpost. Through some quick thinking, he does find a way to be able to break through, singing a nice little ditty along the way. And then from there, we jump into the final part of this book. Now, like I said, it was supposed to say the time that was the major factor for me completing this any sooner. The motivation was definitely there. This part, well, for the most part, was very interesting. I wanted to know more about these characters. This Gavroche was quite fascinating. And one of the other things as well that doesn't really get brought up as much is that Gavroche is actually the first son that the innkeeper's wife threw off into the street. So unbeknownst to him, he actually took care of his brothers, which, according to this part, are never to be seen again. Basically, Gavroche is just like, well, I gotta go off to work, maybe you can try to find your guardian. And then, that night, they never returned to the elephant. It just disappeared into the street. Like I said, this was interesting. Until Victor Hugo had to spoil it with all this deep description of Argot, as well as what the difference between a revolution and an insurrection is. The more I read this, the more I can definitely see how this would make a play. Because if you were to just remove all these little rants, shall we say, you could probably be down to a book that's maybe 800 pages, I would say, as opposed to, well, let's see, how many pages is this book? 1,463. Mm-hmm. So, that is all I got. I hope you will join me for what I'm going to guess is either going to be a very epic conclusion or a very depressing conclusion. Or perhaps both. I mean, the book is called The Misérables. I'm not really guessing this is going to have a happy ending. Until next time, keep having fun.